Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Ash Sarkar, filling in for Michael Walker, who, don't worry, is safe and well. Can I say the same for Aaron Bastani, though? Aaron, let us know of your condition.
I'm perfectly all right, Ash, and I'm not on the naughty step, and neither is Michael Walker, dare I say.
He's always on my personal naughty step. That man has done me wrong. Anyway, coming up on tonight's show, the Transport Secretary resigns, Ireland's upcoming general election, how's that going? And the beef between Kemi Badenoch and Irish rappers Kneecap. MPs have voted on the assisted dying bill after a 5-hour debate in the House of Commons. Here's how that vote went.
Order! Order.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 275.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 275. The ayes have it, and look!
That means the bill has passed its second reading, with a majority of 55 MPs backing it. It will now move to the committee stage, where it will be scrutinised more carefully, giving MPs a chance to make amendments at the next stage. Now, the issue of whether the NHS should provide medical assistance to terminally ill patients who wish to die has been a divisive one. And that showed outside Parliament as the debate began, with protesters representing both sides out in force. These included freedom of choice campaigners, disabilities rights activists, and religious groups. Because the bill introduced by Labour MP Kim Leadbeater is a private member's bill, MPs were given a free vote on it. That meant there was both opposition and support from within every political party. Pitching her bill to Parliament, this is how Kim Leadbeater opened the debate.
Let me say to colleagues across the House, particularly new colleagues, I know that this is not easy. It certainly hasn't been easy for me. But if any of us wanted an easy life, I'm afraid we're in the wrong place. It is our job to address complex issues and make difficult decisions. And I know for many people this is a very difficult decision. But our job is also to address the issues that matter to people. And after nearly a decade since this subject was debated on the floor of the House, many would say this debate is long overdue.
Now, one of the strongest arguments put forward by those in favour of the bill is the avoidable agony that some people currently suffer while dying. In her presentation of the bill, Leadbeater gave many examples of what patients, as well as families and loved ones, had to endure in the last days of a life. This was one horrific case.
Lucy's husband, Tom, was 47, a music teacher with a young son. He had bile duct cancer, which obstructed his bowel, resulting in an agonising death. Tom vomited faecal matter for 5 hours before he ultimately inhaled the faeces and died. He was vomiting so violently that he could not be sedated and was conscious throughout. Lucy pleaded with the doctors to help. The doctor treating him said there was nothing he could do. His family say the look of horror on his face as he died will never leave them. Lucy now has PTSD, which is quite common for families who lose loved ones in such harrowing circumstances.
Intentionally helping another person to end their life is currently illegal under the 1961 Suicide Act and carries a maximum prison sentence of 14 years. And doctors who help someone to die in this way are also more likely to face criminal prosecution than non-doctors. Now, Leadbeater's bill has very specific restrictions. Only terminally ill people would be considered for medically induced death, and even then, 2 doctors and a judge will have to agree that the patient is mentally competent to make the decision, hasn't been coerced, and has fewer than 6 months left to live. But making an accurate judgment of survival times is not an exact science, leading Tory MP Danny Kruger to make this intervention.
Let's look at terminally ill. As I said, in many ways the whole question turns on this. I'm afraid this is a term of great elasticity, almost to the point of meaninglessness. It is well known, as the Honourable Gentleman said earlier, that it is impossible for doctors to predict with any accuracy that somebody will die within 6 months. It is a purely subjective judgment made in this case by a doctor whose job is approving assisted death. They simply have to determine for themselves that not that it's reasonably certain that death will occur, but it can be reasonably expected. So basically, it's possible.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. The thrust of the bill, as I understand it, is to ease suffering and pain with a patient who has a diagnosis who is going to die of the condition which has been diagnosed. But that right could only be exercised within a 6-month period. The pain could be a lot longer than that. The discomfort could be a lot longer than that. Has he heard, because I haven't, what is the importance of 6 months? Why not 8? Why not 10? Why not 12? And what would stop people challenging it on the grounds of the dam has been breached, the 6 months is entirely arbitrary, and therefore it could and indeed should be extended by negative resolution of a statutory instrument?
My honourable friend makes absolutely the right point, and I'm afraid to say that is absolutely the case. It is completely arbitrary, the 6 months cut-off. It's impossible to determine. It's a line in the sand. And of course it could be challenged, as so much of this bill could be challenged on human rights grounds, because every one of the safeguards that has been introduced by the Honourable Lady is in fact, in practice, will be a barrier of discrimination against the new human right that has been awarded to one group that should of course be awarded to all.
What some see as the arbitrariness of the 6-month time limit, as well as the possibility of legal challenge to the checks in the bill, is the basis of what's called the slippery slope argument. Opponents to the bill have said that once doctors are allowed to help some very specific patients die, it will eventually become an option for an ever-expanding group of people. This was Labour's Diane Abbott.
People keep saying that this bill can't be amended, but of course any future government could bring in new clauses. And we can see what happened in Canada, which introduced assisted dying in 2016 for adults with terminal illnesses. In 2021, it was extended to people with no terminal illness and the disabled. And in March 2027, anyone with a serious mental health problem will also be eligible. The House should remember that no single organisation representing the disabled supports this bill.
Other opponents argued that the bill was filling a gap that should be better addressed with properly funded palliative care, a point that Labour's Meg Hillier took up.
We were the first country in the world to recognise palliative care as a separate profession. And some of the tragedies we've heard about today are because of a failure in that system. And a failure in palliative care and support is not a reason to continue. And I have a personal experience, many of our members of this House will remember, when my daughter was very ill a few years ago. And I had not intended to speak about this today, but she was admitted to hospital with acute pancreatitis as a teenager. So this bill would not have covered her at that point. But I did not know for 5 days, in fact, many months, whether she would live or die. And those first 5 days, she did not sleep and she did not eat and she was crying out in pain. But I saw what good medicine can do, that palliated that pain, that got her to a place where, although for 2.5 months she was unable to eat, she was saved. And the key thing was she was not in pain. Well, she was in pain, but it was managed. Our best friends were the pain nurses and the anaesthetists.
MPs who have objected to the bill will now have several months to table amendments that address their concerns. And in an unusual step for a private member's bill, the committee tasked with scrutinising it will have the power to take evidence from experts, parties with an interest and lawmakers from other countries. But the assisted dying bill is still some way off from becoming law. It may face challenges in the House of Lords and will face 2 more Commons votes, a process that could take 6 months or more. Aaron, so just to put you on the spot, if you were an MP and you were called to vote on this bill, what way would you have gone and why?
I would have voted for it. I believe in assisted dying. I believe in the right to bodily autonomy. I think many of the counter arguments against it, actually, you put yourself on a slippery slope. We're hearing that argument repeatedly. Diane Abbott, for instance, said that this law could be changed in the future. It could become more like Canada. You can say the same about abortion. Once you introduce the right to an abortion, term limits can go down, they can go up, things can change. That's not an argument against the right to bodily autonomy. So as somebody who fundamentally believes in that, I would be voting with my conscience. And by the way, I'd be voting with the vast majority of public opinion. The largest polling on the right to assisted dying was carried out by Opinion. This year, over 10,000 respondents, 75% of people that were asked supported it. 75%. 66% of people of faith supported it. Every single constituency in the country has a majority of people who support it. I think about 65% plus of people with disabilities support it. We have polling, we have large quantitative data sets for a reason, because anecdote and your Twitter timeline isn't necessarily reflective of reality. So I would have supported it for those two reasons. I believe in it as a fundamental right. And when you look at where the public is at, it's very clear there is a consensus for this. There's a majority for it. I do not think we should become like Canada in terms of implementation. I think that's very bad. But then countries elsewhere implement laws very poorly, like, for instance, the right to abortion. We wouldn't say, oh, well, because they're executing it poorly, therefore we won't give people that right to bodily autonomy and self-determination.
What do you make of the argument, because I'm curious about what you think, what do you make of the argument that has been made by some disability rights activists that, one, this is a slippery slope, as you mentioned, but two, this implicitly devalues disabled life, because once you're saying, okay, there's a threshold of pain, a need for care, after that, you're saying to people you're better off dead. I mean, what do you make of that this does have an impact on how we view disabled life, even if at this point, the way the bill is drafted, it will only apply or only be available to people with terminal illnesses who've got 6 months or fewer to live?
Well, you're having to make the arguments for or against this legislation, which is about people with terminal illnesses with 6 months less to live or not. You can make, of course, an argument against future legislation, which is not what we're talking about here. But then, of course, that's just we can have that argument ad infinitum. I can't defend a piece of legislation which isn't being proposed. Do I support what we've seen in places like Canada, where you see people, for instance, who have mental health conditions, quote unquote, choosing to end their lives, maybe because of housing precarity? I've seen one instance of that. Do I agree, for instance, with people as young as 12 having the right to assisted suicide? You're not even an adult able to consent to that. No, I don't agree with that. So there are clearly certain conditions which need to be met, I think, in a civilized society implementing this properly. But I just think there are so many straw man arguments here, Ash. So many. And I think, when you hear these arguments being made, the vast majority of the time, these sound like arguments, for instance, against abortion, right? It's a slippery slope. It could be implemented poorly, or it would be an argument against all manner of things which we think are normal. Divorce, we think of divorce as normal. Divorce has definitely had negative externalities, right? I believe, by the way, in the right to divorce. It's definitely had negative externalities. We're pretty sure, for instance, that there are more broken families, etc., because people can now leave unhappy marriages. Good, by the way, because they're unhappy. But if you're talking about negative externalities, of course, there are downsides, but they're massively outweighed by the upsides, in my view, anyway. So I think the slippery slope argument is poor. In terms of the disability argument, as I said, there's the opinion polling. And look, polls aren't always correct, but they're the best we can go on. The opinion polling, I think, had people with disabilities, I think it was something like 76% of them supported the right to assisted dying. Now, why are we seeing such a disconnect between this polling I'm appealing to, the arguments I'm making, and what you see online? That seems rather strange, right? Massive support for this seemingly amongst the public, and yet that's not reflected in social media or the kinds of conversations that MPs are having. Well, because the older you get, the more likely you are to support assisted dying. And there aren't many 75-year-olds and 80-year-olds on Twitter and Instagram. So I would say that, yes, of course, in a way, the right to assisted dying necessarily devalues life in so much as it says a person's choice is more important, perhaps, under certain conditions, than their ability to continue living. Again, we make that argument for abortion, right? You could argue abortion devalues a life. I don't think that. I don't think a fetus is a life, but that's an argument one might be able to make. We have abortion because we believe in the right to bodily autonomy, and one person not being able to tell another what they do with their own physical being. And I think that's really, really important for a civilized society. I think it's tremendously important. Could this law be used in negative ways that massively hurt, hinder, undermine the happiness the basic rights of people with disabilities? Of course it could. Absolutely. Of course it could. But that's why the legislation as it is being drafted right now is so limited. And I agree with this legislation. In future, if people try to change the boundaries of that, then I would absolutely push back against that. And this idea that people change the legislation willy-nilly, look at abortion term limits. They've not changed in a really long time. People don't try and change those. And I suspect the national conversation in regards to this would be very similar. I'll finish with this, Ash. The reason why I feel so strongly about this is I've seen somebody in the final stages of Huntington's, which is a genetically inherited condition. Their wife was a practicing Catholic. They basically lived in their front room for years. You've never met a more extraordinary partner than this woman, what she was going through. The point is, I don't think I have any right to tell somebody else they have to do that. What she did was extraordinary. I think actually it's the pinnacle of human spirit in some ways. Could I do it? I don't know. Would I expect my own partner or wife to do it? No. Would I expect some random person to do it? No. These are ethical matters for one's individual choice, rather than this person telling this person, well, actually, you can't do what you want with your own body. I do not agree with that.
I mean, just before we move on, I suppose the thing that I wanted to say is that sometimes it feels as though the two sides are speaking at cross purposes, because you have disability rights campaigners who are rooting their objections in their own experience and their own fears, which, by the way, have very reasonable and materially justifiable origins. I mean, one reason why I saw one disability rights campaigner objecting to the assisted dying bill was because, as she pointed out, how am I supposed to trust doctors to value my life when during the COVID pandemic, you had disabled people waking up with "do not resuscitate" written on their notes without their consent? That's a perfectly reasonable conclusion for that person to come to. I can't trust a doctor. Equally, and again, this is coming from a similar experience of having been up close to somebody dying, in this case my parent, in March of this year. I don't know how he would have felt about assisted dying. I don't know if it would have even been applicable in this area. That's not what I'm suggesting. But when you're up close to someone in a state of fear, pain, and distress, it really brings home to you the importance of agency and control. And so if that's the choice you want to make, because that's your attitude towards life and death, that's fine. But to not have the option to end your life, that's having a choice taken away from you. And I think that rather than it being about devaluing life, I think that people, whether they're thinking about physical pain, whether thinking about cognitive decline, whether they're thinking about increasingly intrusive care needs, what's in their mind is, will I die long after I've ceased to become recognizable to myself? And I think that that's the fear that people are speaking to. Anyway, moving on. Watching that debate today, I found myself wondering how MPs come to the positions they take when they have a free vote, as they did here. When a bill is a piece of government legislation, it's usually straightforward. If you belong to the party of government, you vote with it, and if you're in opposition, you vote against. Of course, MPs do occasionally rebel when they have strong personal feelings about the bill, but when it's a free vote, MPs don't have to justify themselves when they break with the majority of their party, and they don't have to justify themselves to their constituents either. Although, in this case, one MP did take that route. Rupert Lowe, who, as you might recall, is no fan of me, is a Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, and he posted this before the vote. Assisted dying. I have my own views, of course, but on such an emotive issue, I thought it was right to consult my constituents. I have been running a local referendum on whether the people of Great Yarmouth support assisted dying or not. The poll closed last night, and the results are as follows. 1,181 constituents participated. Their eligibility to vote as a Great Yarmouth resident was verified. 892 voted in favour of assisted dying. 289 voted against assisted dying. My constituents have spoken, and that is how I will vote tomorrow. Now, of course, it's only a very small sample of Lowe's constituency that responded, but still, it's an extremely rare case of an MP taking a democratic steer from their constituents on a free vote. Though a few MPs during the debate did talk about how their votes had been informed by the personal stories of constituents. But it begs the question, if they're not being guided by their party and they're not being instructed by their constituents, why are the personal beliefs of MPs, essentially a bunch of randoms, relevant when it comes to making a law that could fundamentally alter our society? And some have been upfront about just how personally they're taking the vote. Labour MP Jess Phillips told The Independent that ministers in the cabinet were following their own moral code on the vote. Of course, we've got no idea what those codes are, and a personal moral code can also be a religious one. Perhaps or perhaps not, after Home Office Minister Seema Malhotra told Labour MPs not to vote on assisted dying on the basis of religious belief. Instead, she urged them to vote on a, quote, secular basis. Is it a free vote when a minister is telling you what principles you should base your vote on? One thing we know about secular moral codes is that they're often no more or less arbitrary than religious ones. Whereas religions preach immutable truths, secular morality often preaches forms of analysis like trade-offs, cost-benefit thinking, majority rule, and favouring individual choice over forms of solidarity. That's perhaps the kind of thinking that's more likely to get a bill like assisted dying through. And when your party leader very publicly promised a high-profile celebrity campaigner, Esther Ranson, that the bill would get his attention, it makes you wonder, just how free can a free vote be? Aaron, I'm channeling Dr. Zeus there, but what do you reckon the right way for an MP to make up their mind is on a free vote? Should they be listening to their constituents, their conscience, their God? I mean, what's the right way to navigate that kind of decision-making?
It's such a great question. Rupert Lowe was an interesting case, wasn't he? And he is one to watch. In some ways, he's a more impressive operator, I think, than Nigel Farage. Early days, of course. Farage voted against this. Rupert Lowe, I think quite smartly, he knew what he was doing, effectively represented older voters on this outside of London. Something I didn't mention at the top, by the way. The place least likely to support assisted dying, although, of course, every constituency in the country, according to that opinion poll, supports it. The place least likely to support it is London, because it's younger, because it's slightly more religious. But the sort of the bedrock of that reform vote, older voters, not in major urban areas, they are the most likely to support assisted dying. So he knows what he's doing. And by the way, that really puts pay to this idea that I've seen on Twitter, which is just ridiculous, that support for assisted dying is somehow some woke metropolitan liberal thing. It's not. That's just simply not borne out by the facts. In terms of what should drive your choices on this, I can understand Seema Malhotra's point, in so much as I'm a Catholic, not particularly amazing one, but I'm a Catholic. I have my own ethical principles, but I don't think that everybody has to adhere to those principles because we're not a theocracy. Now, broadly, I think they're good principles. Don't steal, don't lie, and so on. But for instance, something like divorce. I support the right to divorce. How on earth can I support the right to divorce when I'm a Catholic? Well, I have a set of ethics in regards to my own personal life, and then I have a slightly amended set of principles when it comes to other people because they haven't adopted the same ethical positions as me. And also, religion isn't about judging people. It's about a personal relationship with a higher entity. So if I was to divorce, I would feel like a failure. I would feel like it's the single biggest failure of my life. I made a set of promises that I haven't kept. However, if somebody else wants to divorce, knock yourself out. It's your business. It's nothing to do with me. So I can understand the argument against religion to some extent. In terms of how I think MP should be operating on this, I think when you look at the polling on this, you look at the strength of feeling in the country. I certainly think that should play a role. I think if you're on the fence, if you're not quite sure, I think that should certainly play a role. One of the criticisms made of Rupert Lowe is that MPs are not delegates. They are there to make up their own mind. This Burkean conception of parliamentary democracy, they lead the conversation, they lead the debate, they don't follow it. I'm not quite sure. I don't think in the 21st century, when you live in a democracy with mass literacy, people are aware of their views, they've thought about their views on many, many topics. People say, oh, they're ill-considered, they haven't thought about it, and most people are ignorant. They say that when they're at odds with public opinion generally. I think in the world we live in, frankly, it's a very weak argument. And I think Rupert Lowe politically did a very clever thing. And frankly, On most issues, I think it would be positive if MPs followed suit.
Today, Secretary of State for Transport Louise Haigh resigned after a spent conviction for fraud came to light. In 2013, before she was a Labour MP, Haigh had reported to police that her work phone had been stolen during a mugging, along with some other possessions. But sometime later, after receiving a new phone from her employers at Aviva, she discovered that she still had her old one. When it was turned on, the phone triggered police attention. Ultimately, Haigh was prosecuted and she pled guilty to fraud by false representation in 2014. Here's Sky News breaking the story last night.
We want to start the show tonight with some breaking news because Sky News can reveal now, for the first time, that Transport Secretary Louise Haigh has admitted pleading guilty to an offence connecting to misleading the police while she was a parliamentary candidate in 2014. Well, our political correspondent, Rob Powell, has this story. Rob, what have you found out?
So we established that 6 months before the 2015 general election, when Louise Haigh was a parliamentary candidate, she'd already been adopted as a Labour candidate, she appeared at a court in South London and was convicted in relation to an incident that involved misleading the police over an apparently stolen work phone. Now, we put this to Louise Haigh and her team, and they have issued us quite a long statement explaining from their point of view what went on here. And I think it's worth reading out that statement in full to establish what she says went on in her point of view. She says that in 2013, I was mugged while on a night out. I was a young woman and the experience was terrifying. I reported it to the police and gave them a list of what I believed has been taken, including a work mobile phone that had been issued by my employer. Sometime later, I discovered that the mobile in question had not been taken. In the interim, I had been issued with another work phone. The original work device, being switched on, triggered police attention, and I was asked to come in for questioning. My solicitor advised me not to comment during that interview, and I regret following that advice. She goes on to say, the police referred the matter to the CPS, and I appeared before Southwark magistrates. Under the advice of my solicitor, I pleaded guilty, despite the fact this was a genuine mistake from which I did not make any gain. The magistrates accepted all of these arguments and gave me the lowest possible outcome, in brackets, a discharge, available. So she is saying that this was essentially a mistake, a misunderstanding, but that she went to police after this got flagged and didn't say anything.
So what Haigh is claiming is that the incorrect police report was an honest mistake. She had assumed that her work phone had been stolen, and after discovering that she still had it, was wrongly advised by her lawyer to give a no-comment interview. The other key point here is that Haigh's 2014 conviction wasn't concealed from the Labour Party. Keir Starmer and Haigh's shadow cabinet colleagues have known about it since 2020. Now, unless more comes to light, and we'll discuss that in a second, it's difficult to see what the moral difference is between a spent conviction that a few people know about and a spent conviction that everybody now knows about. Another question, how did the media get hold of the story? Here's Sky News again.
Now, how this story has come to light is through a number of sources that have been talking to Sky News. And we have three separate sources, who tell a different story. They say that the reason why that false report was made to the police, that it was made for personal gain on Louise Haigh's part. We also have two sources that say that at the time where she was working at Aviva, that she lost her job there as a result and following an internal investigation at Aviva. So it's a complicated picture, a complicated set of circumstances that happened 10 years ago. We also understand that she informed the shadow cabinet when she was appointed to the shadow cabinet. She informed the party of this as well. We haven't had any response from Downing Street as yet, and we haven't had any response from Labour. But clearly, I think when you put together the sources that we have compared to the on-the-record statement that we now have from Louise Haigh, I think there are still significant unanswered questions about all this.
Let's start with the unanswered questions. What's being suggested by Sky News' sources is that the police report wasn't an honest mistake. They're saying that Haigh knowingly made a false report in order to get a new phone from her employer, something that Haigh strongly denies. The Times reports this detail. The Times has been told that the company launched an investigation after Haigh said that company mobile phones had been stolen or had gone missing on repeated occasions. Aviva referred the matter to the police and Haigh was prosecuted in 2014. She pleaded guilty at a magistrate's court. The conviction is now spent, which means it has been removed from her record. This is just my opinion, but I think a spent conviction for a minor offence shouldn't be a resigning matter either way. But it does matter if Haigh is being dishonest now, because that's a matter of personal probity while holding a position in government. And in any case, who snitched? As per the report, there were 3 separate sources talking to Sky, and obviously we can only speculate on who they might be. It could be individuals who worked with Haigh at Aviva, or who were familiar with her case at the time. Or it could be an internal Labour hit job. You might remember this from just last month. So this is a BBC News story, big picture of Louise Haigh and a headline that says Starmer rebukes minister over P&O boycott call. As you might recall, P&O Ferries' parent company, DP World, suggested that they might not go ahead with a £1 billion investment at London Gateway. This was when they were invited to Keir Starmer's swanky Global Investment Summit. Here's what Louise Haigh said, which caused such consternation from that same BBC article. I've been boycotting P&O Ferries for 2.5 years, and I would encourage consumers to do the same, she said. The Transport Secretary also described P&O Ferries as a rogue operator. These comments, which were in line with Starmer's own position at the time of P&O Ferries' fire and rehire, put the Prime Minister in an uncomfortable position. Back his own shadow cabinet minister, or in this case cabinet minister, or twirl for corporate capital. I'm just speculating here, but it's not beyond the realms of imagination to wonder whether a Labour right-winger sensed an opportunity to get rid of a slightly more left-wing cabinet minister and also get revenge on Lou Haigh for spoiling the investment summit. Heidi Alexander has been named as Hay's replacement as Secretary of State for Transport. Alexander began her political career working in Cherie Blair's office. She then became MP for Lewisham East in 2010 and was the first shadow minister under Jeremy Corbyn to resign as part of the 2016 chicken coup. Ah yes, fond memories. After a stint as Deputy Mayor of London for Transport, she returned to the Commons as the MP for Swindon South earlier this year. So Aaron, I suppose I've got 2 questions for you. The first one is, should a spent conviction be a resigning matter for anybody? And the second question is, what do you think the motivations could have been for someone going to the media with this?
On the spent conviction, well, I suppose it depends on the conviction. You know, you can have a spent conviction for quite a lot. But in regards to something like this, I mean, of course, I personally think it shouldn't really matter. It sounds like she's been quite naughty with regards to an iPhone 6 10 years ago. I'll be honest, I don't care. I don't care. She is the Secretary of State for a really important portfolio under this government, transport. She's basically been the person tasked with overseeing the bringing back of rail into public ownership. Much more besides too. The idea that you would remove the person who's overseeing that because of something they did 10 years ago, which they told the then party leader, now PM, told their colleagues, I find it ridiculous. You know, imagine if there was a top business and your chief financial officer, your chief operations officer, doing a really good job, really important job, and the CEO says, sorry, we're going to have to let you go because 10 years ago, you already told me about this, by the way, but I've just decided now things have changed. 10 years ago, you misled an insurance company about how you lost your phone. Worst case scenario, by the way, maybe she's telling the truth. I mean, who knows? But let's just say you're now going to leave. I mean, do you think that's a smart business decision? Do you think an intelligent business, which has got its eyes fixed on achieving its objectives, behaves like that? People go, what are you talking about? These guys are idiots. I'm not going to invest in them. I wouldn't want to work with them. I don't want to have my career with them. They're morons. So we wouldn't expect a private business to behave like that. And yet the government can. You know, this lady was in charge of a department with tens of billions of pounds to spend. And this is enough. So no, I find it ridiculous, frankly. Of course, you can make the counter argument, well, she was involved in something untoward. It's unacceptable. She shouldn't have that job in the first place. But the point is she told Keir Starmer about all of this before. So what's changed? And in terms of the people who've got hold of this story, it is really fascinating, isn't it? Yesterday, the legislation that she was responsible for, this Keystone piece of legislation on bringing rail back into public ownership. That got royal assent yesterday. And at the same time, we also had, I believe, the National Strategy for Integrated Transport also announced by Louise Haigh. So you have royal assent for one piece of legislation, a big announcement with regards to integrated transport. And then the next day, this comes out, or even late last night, in fact. But then today, of course, she's resigned. This does feel like a political drive-by. And the Times saying what they're saying, the fact it's in the Times, I have no idea if it's true. But in the absence of evidence to suggest that it is true, I suspect it's something which a political foe of hers has managed to get hold of, and they've used it to push her out. On Sky, you saw somebody say there are multiple sources. Of course, the multiple sources are probably saying different things. I presume one of those sources is Louise Haigh's own office. So that doesn't mean necessarily very much. I've been told today by a decent source inside Labour that Heidi Alexander has been groomed for this job for a really long time. She comes from the right of the party. And that actually the Labour leadership wants to go big on a Heathrow third runway. And they viewed Louise Haigh as potentially being a barrier to that. So I think that's the deeper political story here, is Louise Haigh, as somebody from the party's soft left, was viewed as being a potential obstruction to the direction of travel. Another one, of course, is HS2. Some people don't think that Labour will have HS2 going to Euston. That's what Gareth Dennis told me in our downstream last week. And I think, Louise Haigh would criticise that were it to happen. So this is, I think, a political drive-by done by the party right, executed arguably by people close to Morgan McSweeney. We can't prove that, of course. It may just be entirely coincidental. This has all happened the day after the legislation she was responsible for got royal assent, and she announced a big new integrated national strategy. It may be entirely coincidental. Somehow, I don't think so.
Ireland is holding a general election today in a tight race to form the country's next government. Pre-election polling shows the three main parties pretty much neck and neck. The incumbents, centre-right Fine Gael, have seen an upswing in popularity in recent months, with polls showing them on 21%. Fianna Fáil, also centre-right, have exactly the same support. Meanwhile, left-wing Sinn Féin, the former political wing of the provisional IRA, suffered a dramatic drop in support over the last year, but has been picking up in the polls more recently. They're now on 20%. All three parties have focused pretty much on the same issues: housing, the cost of living, and to some extent, migration. But parties have had just 3 weeks to campaign, with Fine Gael leader and current Taoiseach Simon Harris calling a snap election earlier this month. It hasn't been an easy campaign for Harris, though. He's made several public missteps, including this one with a care worker.
Section 29 worker. We fought for money. Yeah, we were. We were ignored.
No, that's not.
Yes, we were.
No, you weren't.
Yes, we were.
Okay, we can take it.
And the disability sector is a joke. You've done nothing for us. Our people are suffering. I'm very passionate about my job.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about disability too.
But there's been no mention in the budget whatsoever. You ignored them. You ignored the carers.
That's not true to say that.
Yes, you do.
Okay,
it has not been mentioned. Keep shaking hands. Pretend you're a good man. You're not a good man.
Okay, well, if you don't think I'm a good man.
Because you don't care about Shane.
What a weird guy. I mean, he looks visibly irritated. I mean, look, you're going to be confronted as a politician when you're out and about. Them's the breaks, but he looks visibly irritated, walks away, and then when he comes back, I mean, I'm sure he didn't mean it this way, but he kind of looks like he's squaring up to her. Just an emotionally illiterate response, which is not what you want from the leader of a political party, but I'm no expert. Anyway, coming out of the last election in 2020, Sinn Féin came second in terms of seats won. That seemed to put it just one election away from achieving its 100-year goal of gaining power and potentially uniting Ireland. But amid social unrest in Ireland over immigration, as well as scandal and internal divisions in the party, that lead appears to have slipped away. Sinn Féin leader Mary Lou McDonald, however, has recently been making gains by harnessing the desire for change in Ireland after a century of rule by various combinations of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil.
I am absolutely struck at the fact that they seem to be suffering from acute amnesia. They have forgotten that, in fact, they have been in government together in support of each other for the last decade. To listen to them, you'd imagine they had just arrived on the scene and that they were going to come up with all of these solutions. They have had ample chances, ample opportunity to make things better, and they have failed.
Both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have ruled out going into government with Sinn Féin. But MacDonald may be eyeing up smaller left-wing parties in this race. Between them, they're polling at around 16%. And on the eve of the election, MacDonald seemed open to a relationship.
After 100 years of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the Tweedledum and Tweedledee as I call them, now is the time for a new government. Now is the time for change, and the momentum for change is behind us. No, I'm not making eyes at anyone. I believe in absolute fidelity to my cause. So no, we're not at the flirtatious stage quite yet. We have to get to first base before we pass it, if that's okay.
First base, a little bit eyebrow raising. Aaron, if the cost of living crisis is hitting hard here, it's on a whole other level in Ireland. And so in that context, one, what do you think that means for the incumbent, Simon Harris? And two, what might that mean for Sinn Féin in particular?
It's so hard to tell, isn't it? Right now, we've seen over 2024 a massive anti-incumbent deluge, frankly. If you're an incumbent right now, particularly in an advanced high GDP economy, you're in trouble. Actually, by that measure, Kamala Harris did okay in November. One exception is Spain. Of course, another exception is Mexico. That's not a high GDP country. There is a bit of a divergence here. So anti-incumbency in 2024, anti-establishment parties doing really well, but they're doing particularly well in high GDP countries. And of course, Ireland is a first world country. It's a global north country, whatever term you want to use. And also by looking at GDP, and of course, that's not necessarily the best way to look at the success of a country, but looking at its GDP, it's one of the wealthiest countries per capita on earth. So if you examine that trend over 2024, you would imagine that the establishment parties of the last century, as mentioned there a moment ago, would be in deep trouble. However, the polling indicates that they're not. And it's a really fascinating one. I suspect the election after this may be the one where they really suffer. And there's probably a political question for people in Sinn Féin right now. Do they want to govern under these conditions? Would it perhaps be more favourable actually for the big two to hold on and for them to have to oversee a really difficult period in office? From what Mary McDonald was saying there a moment ago, I don't think that's what she wants, but I bet that's a live political debate right now amongst the Sinn Féin rank and file, amongst their cadre. But I suppose when you've been waiting for a century to govern, then I do understand that. I would imagine it's going to be extraordinarily close, and Irish politics will continue to defy broader trends. There are very few countries in Western Europe or Europe altogether, actually, where you've had parties like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael last as long as they have. The only other country I know like it, here's a bit of sort of political sort of stato behavior coming your way, as far as I understand, people can of course correct me, is Iceland. Iceland had effectively the same party of government between 1930 and 2008 with the Independence Party. And their second party was a party called the Progressive Party, I believe, which was basically the Rural Farmers Party. And of course, Iceland, like Ireland, quite rarely for Western Europe, was a colony. So there you go. That's given those two countries an incredible record for the dominant party, the parties associated with post-independence rule, that you don't really see in places like France, the UK, Italy, Germany, and so on. In terms of what happens next, no idea. I do think that the Irish sort of political scene, so to speak, over the next 5 years will be very bad because, like you said, the cost of living crisis there is far worse. The housing crisis there is far worse. However bad you think it is in London, it ain't Dublin. And at some point, that is going to find a mass political expression. Probably not right now, but I think very soon. And the question for Sinn Féin is, are they going to be part of that? Or are they going to be perceived as the establishment that's also swept away or certainly doesn't get near power?
I mean, one thing to keep an eye on is that really for the first time, far-right political elements are contesting elections, really. So that's something which is relatively new in Ireland. So far doing it as independent candidates rather than under the umbrella of a party, but certainly with the rise in anti-immigration sentiment, one to look out for. Ballied Up rappers 1, Kemi Badenoch 0. Today, the UK government decided not to contest a discrimination case brought by the Belfast rap group Kneecap, saying that it would not be, quote, in the public interest. So, what kicked it all off? Back in December 2023, Kneecap applied for a grant offer to UK registered artists. Their application was approved by the British phonological industry, and they were meant to be given just over £14,000. But it was blocked by none other than Kemi Badenoch, who was the business minister at the time. The Guardian reported this last June. A spokesperson said the government did not want to give taxpayers' money to people that oppose the United Kingdom itself. Now, I'm no fancy big city lawyer, but that seems like a pretty clear-cut case of discriminating against artists because of their political beliefs. Nowhere does it say that people who believe in Irish reunification shouldn't be recipients of taxpayer funding, particularly when a significant number of taxpayers in the north of Ireland are themselves Irish Republicans. Here's Kneecap arriving at court this morning and then giving a statement after the UK government conceded their case.
Today, unsurprisingly, the British government's own courts ruled that they acted illegally in stopping funding the Kneecap. For us, this action was never about £14,250. Could have been 50 pence. The motivation was equality. This was an attack on artistic culture, an attack on the Good Friday Agreement itself, and an attack on Kneecap and our way of expressing ourselves. Today, we will send the full amount awarded to 2 youth organisations in Belfast who will work with the 2 communities to create a better future for our young people. £7,125 will go to Glornamona and Ballymurphy, and £7,125 will go to our city, Belfast, on the Shankill Road, and that's the deposit we got for it. The former Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, and her department acted unlawfully, and this is now a fact. They don't like that we oppose British rule, that we don't believe that England serves anyone in Ireland, and the working classes on both sides of the community deserve better. They deserve funding, they deserve appropriate mental health services, and they deserve to celebrate music and art, and deserve the freedom to express our culture. They broke their own laws in trying to silence Kneecap. The reason for this was that they didn't like our art, in particular our beautiful 2019 tour poster of Boris Johnson on a rocket. They didn't like our views, in particular our opposition to a united kingdom and our belief in a united Ireland, which is our right to do. They didn't like the fact that we're totally opposed to all they represent, embodied right now by their arming of genocide in Gaza. What they did was a fascist type action, attempting to block art that does not agree with their views after an independent body made a decision. Their own courts have now found in Kneecap's favour, as we knew they would. They tried to silence us, and they have failed. We wish to give a massive thanks to our lawyer, Dara Mackin, and our barristers, Joe Brawley and Ronan Lavery. They told us at the outset that this was a penalty kick without a goalkeeper, and it sure was. Back on net. Seriously, on Palestine, free Palestine.
I just wanted to show you that whole video because you can see Kneecap rolling up in a Royal Ulster Constabulary Jeep, which is basically a symbol of colonial oppression and police brutality. So a real case of reclaiming something, and it's very punk. It's very punk. I'm into it. Taking the L as gracefully as always was Tory leader Kemi Badenoch. Her spokesperson said this. This case is not about whether a band promotes violence or hates the UK, as Kneecap clearly do. This is about whether government ministers have the ability to stop taxpayers' money subsidising people who neither need nor deserve it. Labour would rather waste your money than stand up to a group of Irish Republicans who go to court because the UK government won't hand them cash. The spokesperson added that, quote, Labour will always capitulate rather than defend UK interests. And Badenoch herself described the move as, quote, yet another cowardly decision after giving away the Chagos Islands. Aaron, the Tories have been banging on about politicised threats to free speech, but it looks a lot like the call is coming from inside the House.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ash. Also, it's really important to say here, this is not a decision that's taken by Labour. We're talking about laws which the whole country has to adhere to and an independent judiciary. It is really remarkable, actually. I have to say that the relationship between the Tories and the Human Rights Act is just so fraught. One day they say we have to get rid of it, and the next you'll see somebody who's very right wing, who's lost their job. Maybe they're they might be a very hardcore Christian who said something not acceptable in a school environment. They're a teacher, for instance. They lose their job and they appeal that through using the Human Rights Act. That happens all the time. And then, of course, the Tories love them. The good old Human Rights Act. Yeah, it's a funny piece of legislation, which, the right seems to love it and hate it, depending on what day of the week it is. But in terms of this particular story, really, really interesting, because, of course, as you've said, Northern Irish people, their taxes are going towards the British state. Many of those people will, of course, have Republican sympathies. It really is a pretty terrifying precedent if you start to say, well, because politically you have a position which we view as at odds with the British state, therefore you cannot get any of the funding which taxpayers, who, by the way, agree with you, which would otherwise be going your way. You can imagine, for instance, a Republican. I'm a Republican, right? I don't think the UK should have a monarchy. Well, given that, the British state is fundamentally tied up with the idea of monarchy, the Crown is fundamentally the state acts on behalf of the Crown, not on behalf of the people, then I can imagine a world where somebody like Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman says, well, Aaron Bastani shouldn't get handouts or the NHS or access to the police and the courts because he's a Republican. Those are the Crown's courts. If you don't respect and observe the Crown, why on earth should you benefit from them? Very, very dangerous line of argument. We have equality under the law. We don't discriminate on the basis of people's political views. Somebody watching this or listening to it, they might not think that Kneecap should get those funds, but believe me, we've used this phrase a lot tonight, but it's true. That is a very slippery slope.
I mean, I also think that it's this idea that UK government money can't go towards anything which supports Irish republicanism. I mean, you might want to check out the Good Friday Agreement because the Westminster government is supposed to remain neutral in the event of a border poll. But anyway, I digress. Thank you, Aaron, so much for joining me tonight.
Ash, it was a pleasure. By the way, you were very good at hosting tonight. You should do this more often. I know you don't have much time, but you're very good at this, much better than me.
Every day I come into the office and Aaron's like, I've got a new job for you. When will that new job just be sitting down and playing Civilization 6? Right? That's what I want to do. And yet this stupid job ruining my life every day. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.